February 19th, 1943. The morning sun rose blood-red over the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia, casting long shadows across the narrow gap known as Kasserine Pass. The air carried the acrid smell of burning vehicles and cordite, mixed with the peculiar metallic tang that soldiers learn to recognize as the aftermath of battle. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood beside his command vehicle, binoculars pressed to his weathered face, watching columns of smoke rise from American positions to the west. His uniform was caked with the ochre dust of the North African desert, and deep lines of exhaustion creased his face. The man the British had dubbed the Desert Fox was about to achieve his last great victory, and in doing so he would glimpse something that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. The Afrika Korps had been fighting for nearly 2 years across the burning wastes of Libya and Egypt, pushing forward, falling back, always short of fuel, always scrounging for spare parts, always watching the Mediterranean supply convoys get picked off by British submarines and aircraft. Rommel's men had learned to fight with nothing. They had become masters of improvisation, cannibalizing wrecked vehicles, stretching rations until they consisted of little more than hard bread and tepid water, nursing their precious Panzer tanks through endless repairs with whatever materials they could scavenge. For these veterans of El Alamein, shortage was not merely a condition of warfare, it was the fundamental reality of their existence. Now, as the attack through Kasserine Pass gathered momentum, Rommel sensed an opportunity that had eluded him for months. The Americans were new to this war. Their troops were green, their commanders inexperienced, their dispositions flawed. Intelligence reports suggested that the supply depot at Tebessa, just beyond the western arm of the Atlas Mountains, contained vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and equipment. If Rommel could break through the pass and capture those supplies, he might sustain his forces long enough to deal a crippling blow to the Allied position in North Africa. More importantly, he desperately needed what the Americans had. His tanks were running on fumes. His men were exhausted. The supplies at Tebessa represented survival itself. The strategic situation in February 1943 was both desperate and momentarily promising for the Axis forces. 3 months earlier, Operation Torch had landed over 100,000 American and British troops on the shores of Morocco and Algeria, threatening to trap Rommel between 2 advancing armies. The British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, had already driven the Afrika Korps from Egypt, pursuing them across 1,400 miles of desert until they reached the relative safety of the Tunisian mountains. Montgomery had captured Tripoli in late January, depriving Rommel of his primary supply base. The end seemed inevitable, yet the geography of Tunisia offered one last chance for a counterstroke. The Americans presented a tempting target. Their 2 corps, under the command of Major General Lloyd Fredendall, was spread thin across the eastern Dorsale, a line of hills and passes that divided the Tunisian interior. Fredendall had made numerous tactical errors that an experienced commander like Rommel could easily exploit. He had failed to reconnoitre the terrain personally. He had dispersed his forces rather than concentrating them at key points. Most tellingly, he had established his headquarters 80 miles behind the front lines, in an elaborate underground bunker complex near Tebessa that his own troops mockingly called Speedy Valley, or Lloyd's very last resort. Hundreds of army engineers who should have been digging fortifications at the front were instead excavating Fredendall's bunker. The attack began on February 14th when the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck at Sidi Bou Zid, a small town about 10 miles west of the Fade Pass. The results were catastrophic for the Americans. German tanks, their crews hardened by years of desert warfare, swept around the American positions with practiced ease. American tankers, many of whom had never been in combat, found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. The German 88mm guns, originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons but devastatingly effective against tanks, destroyed American armor at ranges where the American shells could not even reach their targets. By nightfall, the Americans had lost over 100 tanks and nearly 2,000 men. Over the following days, the rout continued. American forces fell back in confusion, abandoning equipment and positions as they retreated toward the western Dorsale. At Spitler, another defensive line collapsed. At Feriana, troops withdrew before they could be cut off. By February 17th, Rommel assessed that he had achieved all his initial objectives and saw an opportunity to expand the operation. With Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's approval, he prepared to push through Kasserine Pass itself, aiming for the prize that glittered just beyond, the American supply depots. The pass itself was a formidable obstacle, a 2-mile-wide gap in the Grand Dorsal chain flanked by steep, rocky hills. American defenders, including elements of the 1st Armored Division and various infantry units, had dug in along the heights and across the valley floor, but they were poorly coordinated, with units from different divisions thrown together under unfamiliar commanders. Communication between positions was sporadic. Artillery support was uneven. The defenders knew they were in trouble, but they did not know how much trouble until the German assault began. On the morning of February 19th, German infantry and armor began probing the American positions. Progress was slow at first. American artillery laid down heavy fire on the valley floor, and the defenders on the heights held their positions with determination that surprised even Rommel. But the Germans were patient and methodical. They identified weak points, concentrated their forces, and attacked with the coordinated precision that comes only from years of combat experience. Italian forces, including elements of the Centauro Armored Division and the 7th Bersaglieri Regiment, fought alongside the Germans with a ferocity that challenged stereotypes about Italian military performance. Colonel Luigi Bonfatti, commanding the 7th Bersaglieri, was killed leading his men forward, earning Rommel's explicit praise in his reports. By the afternoon of February 20th, the defenders' lines began to crack. Under intense pressure, coordination broke down. Some units held while others fell back, exposing flanks and creating gaps that German forces quickly exploited. The Afrika Korps Kampfgruppe and units of the 10th Panzer Division rolled through the pass, their tanks grinding over the rocky terrain as they pushed toward the roads leading west to Tebessa and north toward Thala. For the Americans, it was a moment of crisis. Plans were drawn up to evacuate Fredendel's headquarters. Orders went out to prepare the destruction of fuel and ammunition dumps. Morale, already shaken by days of defeat, threatened to collapse entirely. It was in this moment of apparent triumph that German soldiers began to encounter something that defied their understanding of warfare. As they advanced through abandoned American positions, overrunning supply points and capturing equipment left behind in the hasty retreat, they found themselves surrounded by abundance on a scale they had never imagined possible. For men who had been fighting on starvation rations, who had learned to treat every bullet and every drop of fuel as precious, the American supply dumps were revelations of an almost incomprehensible nature. The first thing that struck them was the food. German soldiers who had been subsisting on hard bread, thin soup, and whatever local produce they could scrounge, suddenly found themselves surrounded by canned goods of every description. There were tins of ham, beef, chicken, and pork. There were canned vegetables, fruits, and soups. There were chocolate bars and candy. There were crackers and cookies packed in waterproof containers. Most astonishing of all, there was coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz grain substitute that German troops had been drinking for years. The K-rations that American soldiers complained about as monotonous and inadequate contained more variety and higher quality than anything the Afrika Korps had seen in months. Cigarettes appeared in quantities that seemed almost obscene. American rations included 4 packs of commercial-grade cigarettes in every meal, with additional cartons available for purchase at military exchanges. German soldiers, whose own cigarette rations had been steadily reduced as the war progressed, stood amazed before crates and crates of Lucky Strikes, Camels, and Chesterfields. For men who had been rolling their own cigarettes from whatever tobacco scraps they could find, this abundance represented wealth beyond calculation. In the coming months, after Germany's defeat in North Africa, cigarettes would become the de facto currency of occupied Germany, more valuable than the worthless Reichsmark. But in February 1943, German soldiers were just beginning to understand what they were seeing. The vehicles and equipment told an even more striking story. American forces had abandoned trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and motorcycles in their retreat, many of them still in working condition. The Germans had become expert at capturing and using enemy equipment, giving captured vehicles German designations with letters indicating their origin, but they had never seen anything quite like this. These were not the battered, repeatedly repaired machines that German units nursed along. These were factory fresh vehicles with low mileage and full tanks of fuel. The half-tracks were newer than anything the Wehrmacht was receiving from German factories. The jeeps, that remarkable American reconnaissance vehicle that could go anywhere and carry anything, were present in numbers that made German officers shake their heads in disbelief. Fuel was perhaps the most critical revelation. The Afrika Korps had been chronically short of petroleum for the entire North African campaign. Operations had been cancelled, advances halted, and retreats ordered simply because tanks ran out of fuel. Rommel had begged and pleaded with the High Command for more fuel, watching helplessly as supply ships were sunk in the Mediterranean by British aircraft and submarines. At one point, his forces had been reduced to extracting alcohol from locally produced wines and spirits to keep their vehicles running. Now, advancing into American positions, his men found fuel dumps containing thousands of gallons of high-quality gasoline. The Americans had so much fuel that they stored it in massive quantities right near the front lines, confident in their ability to resupply. Ammunition told a similar story. German forces had learned to carefully husband every shell and bullet. Artillery barrages were calculated with mathematical precision, weighing the tactical necessity against the irreplaceable expenditure of rounds. Tank commanders knew exactly how many armor-piercing shells they had remaining and planned their engagements accordingly. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have no such concerns. Their ammunition dumps contained shells, bullets, and explosives in quantities that suggested an entirely different approach to warfare. Where German quartermasters counted every round, American supply officers apparently counted in tons. The equipment beyond vehicles and ammunition further reinforced the message. American soldiers had sleeping bags, while German troops slept in whatever blankets they could find. Americans had field jackets and multiple changes of uniform, while German soldiers wore the same uniforms until they fell apart. American mess kits were newer and better designed than German equipment that dated to the First World War. Even small items, things that might seem insignificant in isolation, added up to an overwhelming impression of industrial capacity that Germany could not hope to match. German officers, trained to analyze enemy capabilities, began doing mental calculations that produced alarming results. If one American division could be supplied with this level of abundance, what did that say about the American economy as a whole? If this was what the Americans brought to North Africa, a secondary theater far from their home bases, what would they bring to the main event in Europe? These were not merely good supplies. This was evidence of an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany possessed or could hope to develop. The personal items found among American equipment added human dimensions to the industrial data. American soldiers carried photographs of their families in manufactured wallets. They had safety razors with replaceable blades, not the straight razors that German soldiers still used. They had writing paper and envelopes, pencils and pens, all mass-produced and readily available. Their personal effects spoke of a society that could afford to devote industrial capacity to creature comforts, even while fighting a global war. German soldiers, whose families at home were increasingly facing shortages and rationing, could not help but notice the contrast. The reaction among German troops varied, but certain themes emerged repeatedly in letters home, diary entries, and later interviews. Some soldiers simply enjoyed the bounty, feasting on captured rations and stocking up on cigarettes. Others felt a growing unease, a sense that they were seeing something that had profound implications for the outcome of the war. A few grasped immediately what they were witnessing. Evidence that Germany was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity made eventual victory impossible through conventional military means. Rommel himself understood the implications more deeply than most. He had been warning the German High Command for months that the supply situation in North Africa was untenable, that without massive reinforcement of men and material, defeat was inevitable. The captured American supplies only confirmed his analysis in the starkest possible terms. The Americans could lose a battle like Kasserine, could have their forces routed and their supply dumps captured, and they would simply replace everything that was lost. Germany could win every tactical engagement in North Africa and still lose the campaign because they could not replace their losses while the enemy could replace theirs many times over. The famous quote attributed to Rommel, that American industrial output made victory impossible, crystallized this realization. While the exact words varied in different accounts, the essential insight remained consistent. Rommel, more than most German commanders, understood that modern warfare was fundamentally a contest of production as much as a contest of arms. The battle, as he noted, was fought and decided by the quartermasters long before the shooting began. At Kasserine, his quartermasters had nothing, while the American quartermasters had everything. The outcome of that logistical contest was already determined before the first German soldier set foot in Africa. This understanding cast a shadow over whatever tactical success Rommel achieved at Kasserine. Even as his forces pushed toward Tebessa and Thala, even as American and British commanders scrambled to establish new defensive lines, Rommel knew that time and resources were against him. His supplies were dwindling while the enemies were being reinforced. His men were exhausted while fresh American divisions were arriving from the United States. His tanks were being cannibalized for parts while American factories were producing thousands of new vehicles every month. The same industrial capacity that filled those supply dumps would eventually fill the battlefields with men and machines that Germany could not match. The events of February 21st and 22nd demonstrated both the tactical skill of the Afrika Korps and the ultimate futility of their efforts. German forces advancing toward Tebessa were halted by Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division, joined by elements of the 1st Infantry Division. American tanks, artillery and infantry formed a defensive position at Jebel el Hamra that proved unexpectedly formidable. Despite repeated attacks, including air support, the Germans could not dislodge the American defenders. The Green troops who had broken at Sidi Bouzid were learning their trade in the crucible of combat. Meanwhile, the thrust toward Thala continued, with Rommel personally accompanying elements of the 10th Panzer Division. British forces from the 26th Armoured Brigade established defensive positions north of Kasserine, and together with remnants of American units, they conducted a fighting withdrawal that extracted a heavy price from the advancing Germans. Each ridge had to be taken, each defensive position reduced, and with each engagement, German strength ebbed while Allied strength was being reinforced. On the night of February 21st, American and British artillery began a massive bombardment that caught German forces in the open. The volume of fire was stunning, a demonstration of the very industrial capacity that had been evident in the captured supply dumps. Shells rained down on German positions with an intensity that precluded any advance. Tanks that had survived years of desert warfare were knocked out by concentrated artillery fire. Infantry that had weathered countless battles found themselves pinned down by shell fire of unprecedented weight. By February 22nd, Rommel recognized that his offensive had reached its culmination. The Americans were no longer collapsing. Reinforcements were arriving from every direction. The British 8th Army to the south was probing the Mareth Line, threatening to catch his forces between two enemies. Supply lines that were already precarious were becoming untenable as Allied air power interdicted the roads. Most critically, the fuel and ammunition that had been so carefully hoarded for this offensive were running out, and unlike the Americans, Rommel could not simply requisition more. In a meeting with Kesselring on February 22nd, Rommel argued for withdrawal. Kesselring, always more optimistic about Axis prospects in North Africa, wanted to continue the offensive, but Rommel was adamant. He had achieved tactical success, had inflicted significant casualties on the Americans, and had captured substantial quantities of equipment and supplies. But he had also failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that might have changed the strategic situation. The defenses at Tebessa and Thala had held. The Americans were learning and adapting. Continued attack would only waste irreplaceable resources against a strengthening enemy. The withdrawal began on February 23rd, with German and Italian forces falling back through Kasserine Pass to their starting positions. American bombers caught the retreating columns, adding to the losses. By February 24th, American forces had reoccupied the pass, and the battle was over. The butcher's bill was significant on both sides. American casualties approached 10,000, including killed, wounded, and captured. Nearly 200 American tanks had been destroyed. But the Germans had suffered losses too. Losses they could not afford, losses of veteran soldiers and experienced tank crews who could never be replaced. The aftermath of Kasserine saw significant changes in the Allied command structure. General Fredendall was relieved of command and replaced by Major General George S. Patton, a far more aggressive and capable commander. The Americans conducted brutal self-assessments of their performance, identifying failures in training, tactics, equipment, and leadership. Changes were implemented with characteristic American speed and efficiency. Units were reorganized. Doctrine was revised. Equipment was upgraded. The army that had been rooted at Kasserine would emerge stronger and more capable, while the Afrika Korps that had won the victory would continue its inexorable decline. Rommel himself wrote about his American opponents with a mixture of criticism and grudging respect that would grow over time. In his papers, later edited and published as the Rommel Papers, he noted that while the Americans had paid a stiff price for their experience in Tunisia, the lessons they learned brought rich dividends. Even at Kasserine, he observed, American generals showed themselves to be advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. The full flowering of American military capability would come later, in the campaigns across France, where Patton's army would demonstrate achievements in mobile warfare that Rommel considered truly astonishing. The strategic implications of what German soldiers saw in those captured supply dumps extended far beyond North Africa. By 1943, the American economy had fully mobilized for war production. Factories that had produced automobiles now produced tanks. Shipyards that had built merchant vessels now launched warships and landing craft at an unprecedented rate. Aircraft plants turned out planes faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. The gross national product of the United States had grown by over 50% since 1939, and war-related production now accounted for 40% of economic output. The numbers told a story of overwhelming advantage. In 1944 alone, the United States would build more aircraft than Japan produced during the entire war. American shipyards would launch enough tonnage to replace every Allied vessel sunk since 1939. The Ford Motor Company, which had produced over 3 million cars in 1941, had essentially ceased automobile production to focus on military equipment, turning out bombers, tanks, and military vehicles in quantities that German industrial planners could only dream about. By the end of the war, more than half of all industrial production in the world would take place in the United States. German soldiers at Kasserine were seeing the leading edge of this industrial tsunami. The supplies they captured were not the result of some special effort or unusual circumstance. They were the routine output of an economy that could afford to send abundance halfway around the world while maintaining civilian consumption at levels that exceeded those of pre-war Germany. A captured German soldier, marched past Allied supply dumps in Normandy the following year, would sum up the lesson succinctly. He knew, he said, how the Americans had defeated Germany. They had piled up the supplies and then let them fall on the enemy. The psychological impact of this realization should not be underestimated. German soldiers and officers had been told for years that their fighting spirit and tactical superiority would overcome any material disadvantage. The Nazi ideology emphasized will and determination as the keys to victory, but at Kasserine that ideology collided with reality. All the fighting spirit in the world could not manufacture fuel when the tanks ran dry. All the tactical brilliance available could not create ammunition when the magazines were empty. The American supplies offered a glimpse of a war that would be decided not by the courage of individual soldiers but by the output of factories they would never see. This realization would spread through the German military over the following months and years. Veterans of North Africa who were transferred to other fronts brought their understanding with them. Officers who analyzed the lessons of Kasserine drew conclusions about Allied industrial capacity that filtered up through the command structure. By the time American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, many German commanders understood that they were fighting against a nation whose resources they could not hope to match, whose losses they could not hope to inflict faster than they would be replaced, and whose ultimate victory, barring some dramatic change in circumstances, was essentially inevitable. The fate of the Afrika Korps illustrated this grim calculus. After Kasserine, the campaign continued for another 3 months. Rommel launched one final offensive against the British Eighth Army at Medellin in early March, but it was repulsed with heavy losses. Shortly thereafter, Rommel left Africa for health reasons, never to return. Command passed to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who conducted a stubborn defense but could not change the fundamental dynamics of the situation. By April, German forces in Tunisia were reduced to 76 operational tanks and were extracting fuel from locally produced wines and spirits. By May, Allied forces had compressed the Axis bridgehead into a small pocket along the northern Tunisian coast. The final surrender came on May 13, 1943. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity, including most of the legendary Afrika Korps. It was, as propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels noted, a second Stalingrad, another catastrophic loss of experienced troops and irreplaceable equipment. The comparison to the Eastern Front disaster was apt in more ways than one. At both Stalingrad and Tunisia, Germany had overextended its forces against enemies whose resources ultimately proved overwhelming. At both, tactical victories and individual heroism could not compensate for strategic overreach and material inferiority. The memory of those captured American supplies lingered in German military consciousness. Officers who survived Tunisia and went on to fight in Italy, France, and Germany itself carried with them an understanding of Allied industrial capacity that shaped their expectations and their decisions. Some became fatalistic, convinced that defeat was only a matter of time. Others sought ways to compensate, pinning hopes on wonder weapons or decisive battles that might somehow reverse the tide. But few who had witnessed the abundance at Kasserine could maintain illusions about the ultimate outcome of a war of attrition against an enemy who could produce material faster than it could be destroyed. For the Americans, Kasserine served a different function. It was a harsh lesson, a bloody demonstration that courage and equipment were not enough without training, leadership, and coordination. But it was also a lesson that could be learned and applied. The American military that emerged from Tunisia was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. Officers who had proven inadequate were replaced. Tactics that had failed were revised. Equipment that had shown weaknesses was improved or replaced. The system that had produced those abundant supplies also produced a learning organization capable of adapting to its mistakes. This capacity for adaptation would prove as important as the industrial capacity that made it possible. The same factories that produced tanks could produce better tanks. The same training establishments that had produced inexperienced soldiers could produce veteran-quality replacements. The same command structure that had tolerated Fredendall could identify and promote pattern. The American system, for all its initial failures, contained within itself the mechanisms for correction and improvement that would lead to eventual victory. Rommel understood this, perhaps better than anyone on the German side. His comments about American commanders and troops reflected a professional soldier's appreciation for an enemy that was learning and growing stronger. The Americans who had broken at Sidi Bouzid held at Jebel el Hamra. The Americans who had fled at Kasserine would stand at Anzio and advance through France. The transformation was remarkable, and it was powered by the same industrial and organizational capacity that had filled those supply dumps with abundance that German soldiers found so astonishing. The Desert War thus became a microcosm of the larger conflict, a demonstration in miniature of forces that would determine the outcome of the Second World War. Germany's tactical excellence could win battles but not campaigns. Allied industrial capacity could lose battles but win wars. The quartermaster, as Rommel observed, decided the outcome before the first shot was fired. At Kasserine Pass, German soldiers captured enough American supplies to see their future, and what they saw was defeat. The significance of this moment extended beyond the immediate tactical and strategic situation. It marked a psychological turning point, a recognition among thoughtful German soldiers and officers that the premises of their war effort were fundamentally flawed. They could win every battle and still lose the war. They could outfight their enemies and still be overwhelmed by material superiority. The ideology that had promised them victory through willpower was revealed as hollow when confronted with the concrete reality of American industrial might. This was perhaps the deepest lesson of Kasserine, more profound than any tactical doctrine or strategic principle. Wars in the industrial age were won not on battlefields alone, but in factories and farms, in research laboratories and training camps, in the aggregate capacity of entire societies to mobilize for total war. Germany, despite its military excellence, was fighting enemies whose combined industrial capacity exceeded its own by a factor of 3 or more. The outcome of such a contest, barring dramatic changes in technology or alliances, was essentially predetermined by the underlying economic realities. The veterans of Kasserine carried this understanding forward into the years that followed. into the retreats and defeats that marked Germany's path to destruction. Some continued to fight with determination, doing their duty as soldiers while recognizing the futility of their efforts. Others began to question more deeply, to ask whether the cause for which they fought was worth the sacrifice it demanded. A few, including eventually Rommel himself, would conclude that the war must be ended by any means necessary, leading to the conspiracy against Hitler that would cost Rommel his life in October 1944. Looking back across the decades, the moment when German soldiers captured American supplies at Kasserine stands as a kind of hinge point in the history of the Second World War. It was the moment when the reality of Allied industrial superiority became viscerally apparent to those on the German side, when abstractions about production, statistics, and factory capacity translated into concrete piles of food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment that German forces desperately needed but could never match. It was the moment when thoughtful men on the losing side glimpsed the shape of their defeat. And it was a moment that carried lessons extending far beyond the immediate conflict. The industrial capacity that won the Second World War would go on to shape the post-war world, to fuel the Cold War and the American century, to establish patterns of global power that persist to this day. The factories that produced tanks and planes would produce automobiles and aircraft that dominated world markets. The organizational systems that coordinated vast military enterprises would be applied to civilian industries with equal effectiveness. The logistical capabilities that moved armies across oceans would move goods and services across the globe. In this sense, what German soldiers saw at Kasserine was not merely a preview of their own defeat, but a glimpse of the world to come. The American industrial system they encountered was already becoming the dominant force in global economics, a position it would maintain for generations. The abundance that seemed so astonishing to men who had fought for years with nothing would become the norm for American society, the baseline expectation of what a modern economy should provide. The patterns of production, distribution, and consumption that shaped the American war effort would shape the American peace as well. For those who stood amid the captured supplies on that February morning in 1943, such considerations were distant abstractions. They were soldiers in the middle of a campaign, focused on the immediate tasks of combat and survival. They appreciated the captured food because they were hungry. They valued the captured cigarettes because they wanted to smoke. They welcomed the captured fuel because their vehicles needed it. The larger implications took time to emerge, to be processed and understood in the light of subsequent events. But the memory remained, crystallized in diaries and letters, in post-war interviews and memoirs, in the collective consciousness of a generation that had witnessed something remarkable. They had seen the future, and it was American. They had seen the war's outcome written in crates and cans and jerry cans of gasoline. They had understood, in that moment of apparent victory, that they were fighting a war they could not win. Kasserine Pass remains a place of historical significance, a 2-mile gap in the mountains of Tunisia, where American soldiers first learned the harsh realities of combat against veteran German forces. But it is also a place of revelation, where German soldiers first learned the harsh realities of fighting against American industrial capacity. The lessons of those February days in 1943 continue to resonate, reminding us that wars are won not only by courage and skill, but by the aggregate resources and capabilities of entire societies mobilized for conflict.